Hi, this is Kelsey Fikowski for AP Gov, and in this video we're going to be looking at some of the exclusive powers that Congress has, along with elections with respect to your local congressperson or your local senator. So let's get into this, and straight out of the AP Gov curriculum, you'll see that we'll be looking at enumerated and implied powers of the Constitution, specifically to Congress, as well as some of the elections that have led to what we call divided government in Congress today. So, right out of Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution, if you have not looked at it, I highly suggest that you do. And here's a new flash for you. You are looking at it right now. And this is basically listing all of the powers specifically of Congress. Everything from borrowing money to regulating the commerce with foreign nations and among states, a very powerful part there. Coining money, establishing a post office, providing for a militia, right? So Article 1, Section 8 spells it out, every single power given to Congress explicitly. That's what we call an enumerated power. When we're talking about enumerated powers, we're talking about they are expressed, right? So going back to here, it says that Congress has the power to borrow money. That's pretty straight and forward, right? They have the right to borrow money. It says it verbatim. It's not vague. It's not ambiguous. It's there. It's expressed. It's enumerated. And again, when you're looking at some of the major powers of Congress, you're going to be looking at power of the purse, meaning that it can raise taxes or lower them, but you don't always see that, and plan a budget. And really where the bulk of the power comes from with Congress is regulating commerce. The Commerce Clause has been so widely used in terms of expanding the power of Congress since the Supreme Court case of Gibbons v. Ogden, that it gives the power of Congress to regulate almost anything that crosses state lines via this clause. Now, what's interesting is if you study the history of the Commerce Clause, it's been used to regulate steamboat operations, as was in Gibbons v. Ogden, but also with justifying the Civil Rights Act. So it's also prevented discrimination. And certainly the Commerce Clause is a major power, but that is, of course, for another discussion. Other important powers of Congress include, in the realm of foreign policy, the right to declare war and simply funding the military. So one thing dealing with the military, one piece of legislation that tends to be a reoccurring question in the AP Gov exam, deals with the War Powers Act of 1973. And this was to give the president 48 hours in which to engage in urgent combat without informing Congress. This is sort of like if there was an important military situation where the president had no time to wait for Congress to declare war and wants to send in troops, well then simply the president would have 48 hours and then would have to begin to inform Congress. Within 60 days from the start of start of combat rather, Congress must take positive action to continue funding the conflict if it is to continue. If no action, the combat cannot continue, and theoretically under this legislation, the troops have to be pulled out. What's interesting is that this has never been utilized, but it is believed to be actually unconstitutional as an infringement of separation of powers. Now you might be like, wait, Congress is the one branch, and it specifies this. It's enumerated that Congress has the right to declare war. However, the president also is titled the Commander-in-Chief of the Army, right? So right there, it would be seen as an infringement of power. Again, this is never used. Keep in mind the context of the Vietnam War, as it's it's not popular, and also the fact that the last time the United States officially declared war was World War II. So this piece of legislation sought to curb the power of the presidency, but has never been utilized. But nevertheless, it's an interesting separation of powers debate. Who has that power? Okay, moving away from that now, other powers of Congress, now specifically the House. We do know that our Congress is bicameral, meaning we have a House and we have a Senate. And in the House, they do have exclusive powers that are directly stated in the Constitution that are given specifically only to the House of Representatives. And in this case, all revenue bills must originate from the House. Remember, the House is supposed to be most responsive to the people. And when it dealt with issues of taxation, that's where you see it. In addition, it has exclusive power with respect to impeachment. It is in charge of charging the president, VP, and other civil officers given to the House. So with respect to impeachment, we don't mean removal. That's not what that word means. Impeachment simply means to bring up on charges. So the House has that sole responsibility, if it chooses to do so, to bring up a government official on charges. Now, similar to the House having powers that are exclusive to them, the Senate also has exclusive powers, and these are also directly stated in the Constitution. In particular, the presidential appointments. So the president is always going to be appointing the secretaries for the cabinets, ambassadors, federal judges, and they have to be confirmed by the Senate. In addition, the Senate also has to approve treaties made by the president. So they do have some significant power in that respect. Now, what's interesting when we talk about Congress in general, not specific to any chamber, major sources of power for Congress include not only this supremacy clause as well as the commerce clause, but also something called the elastic clause. And this provides Congress the power to make all laws necessary and proper. This is an implied power. And this comes out of the case of McCulloch v. Maryland, where Maryland is trying to tax the national bank. And ultimately, this goes up to the Supreme Court. And the national government wins because it says it is necessary and proper to have a bank. And at this point, the national government will win. This is a huge boon because, again, they use this necessary and proper. Make all laws necessary and proper. Notice how vague this is. Would it be necessary and proper to give every American $10,000 a year? Well, if they wanted to try to justify it, they could try under this implied power. Now, also important powers of the Congress include oversight of the budget. So certainly the president will propose it, and at the end of the day, Congress will pick it apart, review it, restrict it, do whatever they need to do. They also have important powers with respect to the budget. When laws are passed, setting up a new government program, Congress has to pass what's called an authorization bill, stating the maximum amount of money that can be allocated to it. After the budget is set, Congress can then set an appropriation, the actual amount of money for that particular year. Another important power of Congress that's sometimes overlooked is its investigatory powers, known as legislative oversight. This is very important. When they investigate issues that warrant study and wrongdoing, and they will conduct these hearings through a committee. So if you recall when Mark Zuckerberg was being grilled at hearings, that's an example of legislative oversight. Do we need to provide more, in this case it might be regulations on social media. Currently, there's very few as to how Facebook collects privacy data and what it can do with that. So legislative oversight happens quite often, and that is a major power of Congress. Now, as we said before, with the elastic clause being an implied power, this is important because it enables Congress to enact laws to properly execute its enumerated powers. If you recall, the enumerated powers are the ones that are listed in the Constitution. So with the necessary and proper clause, again, the elastic clause, it is able to allow Congress to carry them out. Now, as I also mentioned before, a major source of power is the Commerce Clause, and this extends Congress's power immensely. This has been used in so many respects, from creating the economic, social, environmental laws, for example, the Endangered Species Act, also the creation of the Department of Education. So certainly Congress has a lot of power when it comes to implied powers that are not directly stated in the U.S. Constitution. Now, segueing now into congressional elections, there's this word known as incumbency, and that, of course, refers to when a person who's already in office seeks re-election. And if you look at the incumbency factor, members of the House have a pretty good chance of getting re-elected. In some years, almost close to about 100%. You'll notice that the Senate is a little bit more difficult, but still they're maintaining at least a high over 55%. And that looks a little bit more of an anomaly. I mean, for the most part, it's hovering around 80%. So there is this incumbency factor. It is actually very difficult to get somebody out of office who is a senator or a member of the House. So ultimately, who wins elections? Well, incumbents, the people who hold the office and are running for election. And of course, there's some reasons for that. Some of these advantages include credit claiming. When a congressperson, let's say, has a new bridge built, they're going to take credit. When they get grants, project money, new programs, part of their pork, they're going to take credit for that. When they do casework, if a constituent isn't getting his or her Social Security check, they will look into it. And again, once that person gets their check, they're going to be a lot happier with that congressperson. Now, another major source is gerrymandering with respect to House elections only, and that's where you have those little weird configured districts that are set up typically to help the party in charge, depending on that state, the state legislatures, make them. So certainly that is a humongous reason why incumbents do win with respect to the House. Other ones include the presidential coattails, as you see here. Not too much of a reason today. Weaker opponents. Again, if you're in a House election, typically your challenger may not be all that well known. People don't pay attention too much to House elections. There's also something called the sophomore surge, in which there's an increase in votes for a congressional candidate that he or she receives in their first bid for re-election. So again, the sophomore surge, how much are you going to attribute to that? I mean, you have to take a lot of these factors together. It's also important to point out that campaign spending is very important because opponents tend to be outspent by a ratio of 12 to 1. Why? Because opponents don't really have a good chance of winning, as we see from the incumbency advantages. And then midterm elections, especially for the House, they tend to draw out lower turnout, so you're not going to get as many people voting, and as a result, that tends to favor the incumbent, so you're not getting as many people out. So taking all these together, this is why incumbents win. All right, continuing on, other reasons include franking privileges. For example, you can send out as a congressperson as much mail as you want to your constituents free of charge. It's a great way to take credit and advertise for yourself for no charge. You want to be visible if you are a member of Congress. You want people to know your name, hopefully for good reasons and not for a scandal. It's important to take trips home, use newsletters, newspapers, technology, etc. And then, as I said before, credit claiming, right? Casework is very important. Securing money for federal projects or something in your house. In my own newspaper in my local town, a $100,000 grant was given to a nearby community for their fire department. And this was a small community that probably could not necessarily afford a fire truck. And in this case, the local congressperson secured $100,000. Right there, that's a wonderful way to be visible to your constituents, take credit, and a good use of pork. Everybody tends to have a negative opinion of pork, however, can benefit small communities, such as this one featured here. Other advantages, certainly with incumbents, they like to certainly portray themselves as working, dedicated individuals, right? They tend to get themselves out there, whether it's social media or on the news. Certainly there are going to be certain issues in which an incumbent is going to take a partisan stand or party line. But for the weaker opponents, right, they tend to be underfunded, unorganized, inexperienced in politics. They get less media exposure as compared to the incumbent. And then with respect to campaign spending, the PACs, the political action committees, are giving most of their money to incumbents because, again, they know that they have the greater chance of winning. Now, where you're probably going to be able to defeat an incumbent is if there's some type of scandal. And a good example of this would be Anthony Weiner, who was certainly embroiled in a major scandal. That can certainly hurt you and diminish your chances. Also, going back to gerrymandering, if you get redistricted, you can certainly, if you're a Democrat and you get redistricted into a more Republican area, well, then you have a much greater chance of losing. So that can be problematic, as we know with gerrymandering. Also, sometimes big tidal waves can defeat incumbents. We saw this in 2010 and 2012 with the Democrats losing substantially in the Senate, also in the House, when there was sort of this anti-Obama tide at that point. Now, going back to party identification here at the top, most members represent the majority party in their district, and most who identify with the party reliably are going to vote for its candidates. That's a very important point to certainly know for the AP exam. Okay, and our final slide here, open seats. That certainly is going to draw more competitors as there is no incumbent. That's when a congressperson or senator is going to resign or retire, and ultimately you tend to see more turnover when it does come to open seats. Now, one thing to note with incumbency, one good advantage is that it does provide stability, which allows members to be more familiar with the process and be more experienced in that respect. But at the end of the day, change in Congress does occur less frequently through elections. It's really open seats or scandals. Some have wondered if term limits are the answer. Texas tried to impose term limits. That was actually declared unconstitutional. the Supreme Court ruling that an amendment would be needed because this came from the states. So that is congressional elections and Congress's respective powers.